They've just told me that the state of Alabama wants to put me to death in the most horrible manner. Me, a woman, a mother, a businesswoman, must protect my husband. And I said to myself,
Death Row, Alabama, 2002. A woman sits in an electric chair, the last person in American history to die this way without a choice. Her name is Lynda Block, and her story isn't just about what she did. It's about who she became, and how a parking lot encounter turned into the most controversial execution of the decade. This is her final verdict. October 4th, 1993, Opelika, Alabama. It's just another Tuesday at the Walmart on Columbus Parkway. Families shopping for groceries. Kids picking out toys. Nobody expects what's about to happen in the parking lot. Sergeant Roger Lamar Motley, Jr., 38 years old, married father of 4, pulls into the parking lot in his patrol car. He's not responding to a crime. He's running errands, picking up supplies for the police department. Simple, routine, safe. But then, a concerned citizen flags him down. She points to a red Ford Mustang. There's a young boy inside, maybe 9 years old. He looks disheveled, confused. The woman worries the family might be homeless, living out of their car. Roger doesn't hesitate. He's the kind of cop who gives his bulletproof vest to rookies. And that's exactly what he did earlier that day. So when he approaches the Mustang, he's completely unprotected. Inside the Mustang sits 51-year-old George Sibley. He's waiting for his wife, 45-year-old Lynda Block, who's making a phone call at the payphone outside the store. Their 9-year-old son sits quietly in the back. Roger walks up, taps on the window. Standard procedure. "Can I see your driver's license, sir?" But George refuses. "I don't need one," he says. He launches into a speech about sovereignty, about not recognizing government authority, about how the laws don't apply to him. Roger's hand moves to his holster, not drawing his weapon, just a precaution. But George sees it as a threat. In one explosive moment, everything changes. George grabs a semi-automatic pistol and opens fire. Bullets tear through the air. Roger spins away, trying to find cover behind his patrol car. He returns fire. One of his shots hits George, wounding him. Roger grabs his radio. 10-0. Officer needs assistance. The parking lot erupts into chaos. Shoppers scream. People dive behind cars. Parents grab their children and run back into the store. And then, across the parking lot, Lynda hears the gunfire. She's still at the payphone when the first shots crack through the air. But she doesn't run away. She reaches into her purse, pulls out a handgun, and sprints towards the sound of gunfire. Roger is focused on George and the Mustang. He never sees Lynda coming from behind. Witnesses later testified that she dropped into a tactical crouch as she approached, raised her weapon with both hands, and fired without warning. Roger spins toward her, trying to react. But it's too late. She fires again. This time, the bullet strikes him in the chest. Without his vest, the injury is catastrophic. Roger Lamar Motley collapses in the Walmart parking lot. Paramedics rush him to East Alabama Medical Center, but there's nothing they can do. He's pronounced dead shortly after arrival. His wife Juanita and their 4 children will never see him alive again. Lynda and George flee the scene. Their son is still in the car. They speed away at 80, 90 miles per hour, police in pursuit. But they don't get far. Within hours, both are arrested. The boy is taken into protective custody. And Lynda Block's journey to death row has begun. But who is Lynda Block? How does a woman, a mother, a community volunteer, end up pulling a trigger in a Walmart parking lot? The answer starts decades earlier. Lynda Cheryl Lyon was born February 8, 1948, in Orlando, Florida. Her childhood was far from idyllic. She later claimed her mother was abusive, physically and emotionally. The two were never close. Lynda grew up isolated, different from other kids. In high school, while her classmates listened to rock and roll, Lynda preferred classical music. She read philosophy instead of watching TV. She was intelligent, independent, and didn't follow the crowd. After graduation, she poured herself into activism in Key West. She became secretary of the Humane Society, investigating animal cruelty cases. She served as president of the Friends of the Library for 2 years. She volunteered for political campaigns. She was even a Cub Scout mom. On paper, Lynda Block looked like the perfect citizen. But beneath that polished exterior, something radical was growing. In 1983, at age 35, Lynda married Carl Block, an 80-year-old military veteran. He'd lost his only son in a car accident and desperately wanted family again. It was an unusual match, but they had a child together, a son Carl adored. The marriage didn't last. By December 1991, they were divorced. Lynda kept the last name, but the split was bitter. And that's when she met George Sibley, the man who would pull her deeper into a dangerous ideology. Lynda and George called themselves sovereign citizens. They believed they didn't have to follow federal or state laws. They renounced their U.S. citizenship, destroyed their birth certificates, driver's licenses, Social Security cards. They even published their own magazine, Liberatus, filled with anti-government rhetoric. But their beliefs weren't just words on paper. In August 1992, things turned violent. Lynda and George broke into her ex-husband Carl's apartment in Orlando. They tied him to a chair, gagged him, and demanded he stop pursuing their property in court. Then Lynda did something unthinkable. She stabbed him once in the chest and walked out, leaving him bound and bleeding. If neighbors hadn't found him in time, Carl Block would have died that night. Both Lynda and George were arrested and charged with aggravated battery on a person over 65. They pleaded no contest. A sentencing hearing was scheduled. But when the day came, they never showed up. Instead, they barricaded themselves inside George's home in Pine Hills, Florida. They surrounded themselves with weapons: 3 handguns, 2 semi-automatic rifles, an M14. They faxed dramatic statements to newspapers and TV stations, declaring they'd rather die than live as slaves. They were preparing for a shootout, but the police raid never came. Officers kept the house under surveillance, but didn't storm in. And one night, Lynda and George simply slipped away into the darkness. They loaded their arsenal into Lynda's red Mustang. On the back bumper was a sticker: "A woman without a gun is a woman without a plan." With Lynda's 9-year-old son in the back seat, they became fugitives. They stayed with friends in Georgia, then decided to hide out in Mobile, Alabama. They were living in their car, constantly moving, always looking over their shoulders. And on October 4th, 1993, they pulled into Opelika just to make a phone call. That decision would cost Officer Roger Motley his life. The trial was a spectacle. Lynda and George refused to cooperate with their court-appointed attorneys. They rejected the court's authority entirely. They even argued that Alabama had no legal right to try them because the state was never properly readmitted to the Union after the Civil War. They claimed self-defense, insisted they were protecting themselves from a rogue officer. But the evidence told a different story. Multiple witnesses testified that George fired first without provocation, that Lynda approached from behind while Roger was pinned down, that she shot him execution-style while he was defenseless. Nobody could say for certain who fired the fatal shot, Lynda or George. But legally, it didn't matter. Under Alabama's accomplice liability law, both were equally guilty of capital murder. The jury deliberated. The verdict came back: guilty on all counts. The sentence: death.
You just told me that the state of Alabama wants to put me to death in the most horrible manner. Me, a woman, a mother, a businesswoman, must protect my husband. And I said to myself,
George Sibley and Lynda Block would both be executed for the murder of Sergeant Roger Lamar Motley. On December 21st, 1994, Lynda entered Alabama's death row. She was sent to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka. She would spend the next 7 years there, never backing down from her beliefs. She refused to file appeals, insisting the courts were corrupt and had no jurisdiction over her. She gave interviews to writers and journalists, talking about life on death row, defending her actions, staying convinced until the very end that she was right and the system was wrong. And then, in 2002, Alabama passed a new law. Death row inmates could now choose between lethal injection and the electric chair. It was supposed to be more humane, give condemned prisoners a choice. But the law didn't take effect until July 1st. Lynda's execution was scheduled for May 10th, just weeks too early. She would have no choice, no option. She would die in the electric chair whether she wanted to or not. And knowing Lynda's personality, people who knew her weren't even sure she would have chosen differently. Lynda Block had spent her entire life defying authority, refusing to conform, standing against the system she believed had betrayed her. She wasn't going to start compromising now, not even at the very end.
I'm going to fight kicking and screaming all the way to electric chair. If they still put me there, they'll have to drag me, because I'm going to resist down to the last moment.
May 9th, 2002. Lynda Block's final day on Earth. She refused to order a special last meal. She refused to write a final statement. Instead, she spent several hours with 3 close friends who came to say goodbye. She met with her spiritual advisor, Sally Meacham, the only person Lynda allowed on her witness list. And as midnight approached, guards came to escort her to the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility. Years earlier, in an interview, Lynda had said she would never go down without a fight. "I don't deserve to die," she insisted. "I'll be kicking and screaming all the way. They'll have to drag me." But when the moment came, witnesses reported something different. Lynda walked into the execution chamber calmly. No resistance, no screaming. She wore a plain white prison uniform. Her head had been shaved so the electrodes could make contact, then covered with a black hood. The chair was called Yellow Mama Alabama's electric chair, used in 1707 executions before Lynda. It was a relic from another era. Lynda kept it short, just one word: no. Then the current was turned on. 250 volts surged through her body for 20 seconds. Then 250 volts for 100 seconds. Witnesses reported seeing steam rise from the wet sponge under the electrode on her left leg. At 12:10 a.m., Lynda Block was pronounced dead. She was 54 years old. She became the first woman executed in Alabama in 45 years, and she was the last person in American history to die by electric chair without the option to choose another method. 3 years later, on August 4th, 2005, George Sibley followed her to the grave, this time by lethal injection. He refused a last meal and hadn't eaten for 2 days. But unlike Lynda, he did speak. "Everyone doing this to me is guilty of murder," he said. Watching from behind the glass sat Officer Roger Motley's family, his widow Juanita, his children, his mother, his sister. For them, it marked the end of a 12-year nightmare. "Justice was served," Juanita said. Roger's mother was more blunt. "Thank the good Lord I had a son like mine and not like George Sibley. 2 people are dead by execution, 1 police officer killed in the line of duty."